stakeholders, tips for product owners. So that's the topic of today. How can we deal with those difficult people we sometimes meet as product owners? Now, when I meet somebody who I experience as difficult, so where there's typically some disagreement or some friction. So I may disagree with what the person says, or I may disagree with what the person does, or I just may find the person not very likable. And disagreement, dispute, conflict is natural. It routinely happens when two or more people are in disagreement and experience a clash of interests. It happens at work, it happens at home. It may not be nice, but it's part of our experience as human beings. So what's the big deal about product owners, about product people? Well, I think as product owners, we are in a position where we tend to experience quite a bit of disagreement. And I think that's really due to the nature of our role. Oh, so this works, good. Use the mouse, not the keyboard. So why do we experience usually quite a bit of conflict? Well, we interact with users and customers, and depending on the nature of the products that you look after and the size of the market, this group of people might be rather heterogeneous, rather diverse, and users may have different ideas from customers, and they may have different needs. So there may be an element of friction. And then there are the business stakeholders who product owners interact with. So for a commercial product, that be somebody from marketing, or sales, support, maybe finance. And again, those individuals come from different departments or business units, have different backgrounds, often different interests, different goals. So, element of friction and conflict there. And then the development team or the development teams product owners work with. And in an agile context, those development teams are cross-functional. So people have different skills, have different ideas, have different perspectives, and don't always agree on every decision. So I think that explains why we experience quite a bit of conflict as product owners, and why dealing or learning to deal with conflict constructively is an important skill. So we can align and guide people in an effective manner. Now, if we manage to do that, if we learn to navigate conflict constructively, then conflict can become a source of creativity, and it can help us enable effective collaboration and strengthen the connections we have with others, and learn something about ourselves. Unfortunately, that's not always what I see, and quite a few conflicts I've witnessed at work weren't really addressed in a constructive and creative manner. Now, to dive a little bit more into different ways, how we tend to deal with difficult people and conflict, I'd like to share a scenario with you, which is taken from my new book. So the assumption here is that a senior stakeholder, Sophie, comes to the product owner, and that we are playing the role of the product owner. So we're being the product owner here in this scenario, in this situation. Listen, I really need you to add this feature to the release, and I'm not going to take no for an answer, says Sophie, the head of sales, as she stands in front of your desk. Now you can feel your shoulders tensing and your stomach tightening. There is no way that you can add more work to the development effort. The development team is already struggling with the current workload. But Sophie is a powerful senior manager who will not be afraid to escalate the issue. So what should you do? Now, you're likely to have different reactions to this scenario, and likely to employ different strategies, but generally we can classify most strategies that people use to deal with conflict into 4 groups. And these 4 groups of strategies, well, they're common, but unfortunately the strategies tend to be unhelpful. And this classification I'm going to share with you is based on the work of a gentleman called J. Oren Sofer, and particularly his book, which is called Say What You Mean. So the first group of unhelpful strategies, or the first attempt how we tend to deal with conflict, the first option that people often engage in, is called competitive confrontation. So applying this to the scenario I just shared with you, it would mean standing up to Sophie and saying, no way, there's no way that I'll add this feature. As you know, the development team's fully loaded. We've committed to a release goal. There's no room to add more work. And anyway, who are you? You come here to my desk, you interrupt my work, and you demand this feature. You don't really respect me. I'm not going to have this. So essentially, we're engaging in an open conflict. And this behavior is often based on the idea, if I don't fight, I'll lose out. And I need to fight, I need to attack in one way or the other in order to protect my interests, and I'm trying to win. And Sophie is the person who's to blame here. I mean, she triggered it, right? I mean, she came to our desk and she demanded this feature. So we're trying to push back here, and we're not afraid to engage in open conflict. Now, if this is a wise strategy, given that Sophie is a senior stakeholder, I'll leave that decision up to you. But it's certainly one option I've seen product people employ. The next option would be to still try and win and put Sophie in her place. We still believe that we're right and Sophie is wrong. But this time we employ more guerrilla tactics. So it's not open conflict, but it's we engage in a more indirect way. So we're being passive aggressive. We're being very difficult. Maybe we're not really committing to anything. So we could say, ooh, what you're asking, Sophie, is going to be very, very tough, as I'm sure you know. We're fully committed and fully loaded here. It's going to be extremely difficult. I'll do my best, but it's going to be tough. I'll add it to the product backlog, but I can't commit to anything right now. I'll have to get back to you on this. And then go to the development team and say, guys, guess what? Sophie came and she requested that feature, and I had to promise her to put it on the backlog, but don't worry, I'll deprioritize it. We'll never get to it. And maybe then go on and talk badly about Sophie, and not only possibly to the development team, but also to other product people, make snide remarks and be sort of, gossip about her, bitch about her. And that way try and put her in a place in an indirect fashion. Again, it's still a form of being confrontational, being aggressive in a way. And so both strategies really operate on the assumption that we're trying to protect our interests here and we're trying to win in one way or the other. Now, the third option would be conflict avoidance. And conflict avoidance in the scenario that I shared with you would be saying, well, is this really such a big deal? I mean, let's be reasonable. And what's happening here? Sophie, she needs a feature. Well, she's a senior stakeholder. She tends to be a reasonable person. There must be a really good reason why she really needs that feature. I'm sure we can inquire that. I'm sure she's going to tell us. So why make a big deal about this? Let's be grown-ups. Let's be rational. Let's split the difference. Yes, it's impossible to fully add the feature to the current release, but we can maybe do half of it. And then, the second part we'll do in a subsequent release. So, that way, at least some of Sophie's interests are being accounted for. And on face value, this may seem like a good strategy. It may seem like, yeah, actually, let's go for it. And for some of you, that may feel, quite comfortable. But I think the problem with it is that it ignores the underlying issues. So there are two underlying issues I would suggest. The first one is that Sophie doesn't really respect us as an empowered product owner. She really treats us as a personal assistant, and she comes to the product owner and demands that the product owner does something for her and that her request gets expedited. So there's a misunderstanding of the role of the product owner, or there is mistrust and misrespect with regards to the individual who fills that role. And then secondly, I would expect that there are product management processes established in the company, and that there's a clear way how to deal with feature requests, and maybe that those feature requests are being reviewed collaboratively in a product roadmap workshop. So I'd expect Sophie to be aware of that and to attend such a workshop, or maybe more appropriately, send one of her sales guys as the sales rep to regularly attend those sessions and then request a new feature. But then it'd be a collaborative conversation, a discussion, and it'd be a joint decision where other stakeholders and development team members will be present. And so what Sophie does is, again, she expects that we make an exception for her, that we expedite her request. And I don't think that's appropriate either. So if we now make a compromise, broker a deal, and split the difference, we let Sophie get away with what I would consider unhelpful and honestly inappropriate behavior. So, that would set a precedence. And, who says that Sophie wouldn't then act in a similar way again in the future? Or other senior stakeholders would copy her behavior. So I don't really think that this approach, conflict avoidance and trying to strike a deal and agreeing on a compromise, would be ultimately helpful. Nor would be passivity, which basically means we just give up and say, look, what can we do? I mean, we're just the product owner here. Sophie is so much more powerful. If we try and push back, if we try and say we can't do this, then she's going to escalate it, and my boss is going to come to me and tell me to do it anyway. So I might as well say yes. And I don't know. I mean, I'll just then have to figure out how I can deal with it. And maybe there's a way I can persuade the development team members to do a little bit more work. Maybe I can tempt them with promising to buy them pizza if they come in at the weekend, and vanilla ice cream and alcohol-free beer and other delicious treats. But of course, similarly to conflict avoidance, I don't think that'd be healthy, because we would give up our own needs and we would let Sophie get away with unhelpful behavior. So we'd allow Sophie to walk all over us, really. So if these strategies aren't helpful, and if these strategies ultimately lead to bruised feelings and mistrust and damaged connections, then what could be a better way to deal with conflict? Well, a not too dissimilar, but admittedly much more extreme challenge was encountered by the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States. Now imagine that you are faced with a group of armed terrorists who have kidnapped a group of civilians, and they're now asking for a ransom, and they're threatening to kill the group of people if their demands aren't fulfilled. So a very, very serious situation. Now, if you grew up like me in the 1980s with Hollywood movies, you might be tempted to suggest sending in a Rambo-like agent who can single-handedly free the hostages and capture the baddies. And it turns out the FBI have tried a similar approach, but in the real world, it has unfortunately a low success but a high death rate. So what they've done is come up with a different approach, and that approach is called the behavioral change stairway model. So no matter if we're dealing with Sophie, a difficult senior stakeholder, or armed terrorists, what we'd like to achieve is a positive behavior change of the individual. So we'd like Sophie to encourage, we'd like Sophie to show a different behavior. We'd like Sophie to understand that the way that she acted isn't helpful. And the key question is, how can we do this? We don't hold any what is referred to as transactional power over Sophie. We're not in a position to tell Sophie what to do. We're not her boss. And we're typically not in a position to offer any incentives in terms of a bonus or pay rise in order to encourage a behavior change. So then the only way we can do this is by influencing Sophie. Now, in order to influencing Sophie means that Sophie is essentially listening to us, that she's listening to our perspective, to our ideas, and that she's taking into account our needs as the person in charge of the product, and that she's following our advice. And this then begs the question, well, how can we encourage Sophie to follow our advice? And the answer is by building trust, by establishing a trustful relationship. So either creating that relationship or strengthening the relationship that we have with Sophie. And of course, then the question is, how do we build trust? And a key mechanism, a key technique in order to build rapport and build trust is empathy. Now, empathy means reaching out to Sophie with compassion and warm-heartedness, no matter how much we might be annoyed by her behavior, how much we might disagree with her behavior and what she has to say, or how much we might dislike Sophie. So it's trying to really develop a warm-hearted, a kind attitude, and really understand what is going on for her, what's happening here, what's her perspective, but also what are her underlying interests and needs, what's in it for her, what drives her behavior, why is it so important to her to come to our desk and request that feature or even demand that feature, why she's making such an effort and kicking up such a fuss. So it's the opposite of what I sometimes do, which is a mistake, and that is telling people why their behavior is wrong or their thinking is flawed and what they should do in order to correct their behavior or thinking. So empathy really means reaching out and accepting what is. It doesn't mean that we approve. It doesn't mean that we agree, but we allow things to be what they are. And that means that people feel valued, that they feel appreciated at a very fundamental level, and they feel understood. And again, that then builds trust. And once we have that trust in place, then people are more likely to listen to us and follow our advice and actually change their behavior for the better. Now, how do we encourage empathy? How do we develop empathy? How do we cultivate it? By actively listening to the individual, by making a real effort to listening to what the person has to say, in our case, Sophie. As listening here is the first and maybe the most important step of this model, I thought I'll share a few more tips on how to deeply or actively listening to a difficult stakeholder. But before I do that, I'd like to say that you can't skip steps in this model. So you have to take one step at a time, and you can't rush the process. And of course, there is no guarantee that Sophie will change her behavior. All we can do is, give it a try our best, and then, see what happens. So a few tips on listening effectively. The first one is be fully present and listen attentively. Sounds a little bit like common sense, but I find that in practice it can be hard. It can be hard to be attentive and listening and be present. You can reflect on your current situation and ask yourself how easy or difficult or challenging it is to actively and attentively listening to what I'm saying. So it really means giving our full and undivided attention to the other person. And that's particularly important when we have an important or difficult conversation. Why? First of all, because understood. I think we sense if somebody's truly listening to us, or if somebody's just nodding but is a little bit of absent-minded. And secondly, it allows us to really take in everything the person has to say. It's the opposite of going off on a tangent and already starting to prepare an answer. Steve Covey once said, often we don't listen with the intention to understand. We listen with the intention to respond, to answer. And so, this is really about being present and really listening to understand. Now, it's difficult for me when I'm wrapped up in difficult thoughts or emotions. So let's assume that Sophie's just spoken to us, and we may feel overwhelmed. There may be confusion, there may be frustration, irritation, there may be anger, there may be worries or anxiety present. So if that's the case, then I would suggest that you consider telling Sophie that the conversation is important to you, but asking her to postpone it. You could say something like, I'm feeling a little bit worked up right now. This conversation is really important to me, but can we please have it later on today in the afternoon, or maybe tomorrow, so you've got some time to digest and process your difficult emotions. Similarly, try not to rush from one meeting to the next, particularly if those meetings are important or if you have important conversations, but schedule some downtime in between so you can digest what happened and you can set yourself up for the next meeting. That makes it easier to be fully present. The second tip is to be respectfully curious and try and suspend judgment and foster an open mind. So coming from a place of curiosity and care, and trying to take a real interest in what Sophie has to say, even if we find it difficult what she's saying or we disagree with what she's got to say, but coming from an attitude of trying to learn and trying to connect and trying to understand, not to criticize, not to judge, not to evaluate. And so I think we've got this great guideline as product people when it comes to working with data, and that is separate data collection from data analysis. So first gather the data and then look at it and draw the right conclusions. And I would suggest that we should try this something similar in difficult conversations, that we should try and first listen with an open mind and allow things to be said, even if we don't agree, or even if we don't like it, even if we find it challenging. And again, just accepting it doesn't mean that we approve, it doesn't mean that we agree. And then take a deep breath and then choose the appropriate response. You know? And so, you know, that's an opportunity then to learn something and be grateful for what Sophie has to share. You know, again, even if we disagree, then, you know, we can still be grateful for her making an effort and, you know, sharing sharing her perspective with us. And then the third tip is around listening not only for facts, what Sophie said, what is being communicated, the words, but also the feelings and needs. So, you know, Sophie stands in front of us with a red face and she speaks in a rather loud voice, then chances are that she's upset. And that'd be an interesting clue. Emotions are pointed to underlying needs. So if Sophie is agitated or upset, then, you know, it'd be interesting finding out why that is. You know, why is requesting that feature so important to her? What is the needs that she has that's associated with it? And a good way to do this is to ask open questions, clarifying questions, which typically start with why or how or what, you know, to dig a little bit deeper and again understand what's really happening here for Sophie. So active listening builds, cultivates, strengthens empathy, and empathy builds trust. But in addition to empathy, there are a few other techniques that you can use in order to strengthen the trust with a stakeholder. And I'd like to share a few more techniques with you now. The first one is to speak and act with integrity. And, you know, superficially, that sounds pretty trivial, probably. You know, it's like, yeah, I mean, say what is true and walk your own talk. Yeah. So what's the big deal? I think the big deal is when it's not easy to say what we feel is true and what we feel is right. So I remember I once had a boss, and he could be a very nice and warm-hearted person, but he could also get rather grumpy, and you know, was working on a major new product development effort, and the effort wasn't going too well. And the longer the situation continued, the more grumpy he would become. And so what we started to do is we started to sugarcoat our messages. You know, when we had some status meetings and said to him, well, yeah, that's not going too well, but really in the grand scheme of things, it's not that bad. And really, you know, these are all the positive things that have happened. And so, no, it's really not that bad. Oh, no, we can make it. It'll be challenging, but we can make it. And started telling white lies. And I don't think in hindsight that was appropriate. It wasn't appropriate because, you know, we were fudging the data, but also because we were supporting his behavior, which I think wasn't helpful. You know, it's not right for the boss to intimidate people and make people feel uncomfortable when they share data that indicates difficulties. So speak and act with integrity builds the trust. Somebody who says what she or he believes is truth is somebody that people tend to trust, have faith in. And then get to know people and allow people to get to know you. It's natural if we know very little about the individuals, and the individuals who work with us know very little about ourselves, then it's kind of difficult to relate to people. We're all influenced by our backgrounds, the family situation we're in, and our interests. And sharing this is useful, so we connect more easily, and it makes it clearer why people think and act in a certain way. You know, so I remember I was in a meeting a little while ago, and an individual who I know as a reasonable and nice person, she hijacked the meeting and she kept going off on tangents. It was really difficult, and I felt really uncomfortable, and I didn't quite know how to handle the situation. And I got quite frustrated. And only after the meeting, I found out that she was still going through a divorce, that she was still in the midst of a very messy and difficult phase of her divorce. And, you know, obviously she was very worked up, and that sort of showed in her behavior and her mind states. She acted out her mind states. And if I'd known this information beforehand, then it would have been much easier for me to relate to what's going on and offer some help and act in a more helpful way. So it shows you that it's helpful to understand what's happening for people. One way to get to know people in better ways is, as Patrick Lencioni suggests in his book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, to share failure stories. When we talk about failure and those failure stories are honest, then we show vulnerability, and that tends to encourage trust, that allows us to earn the trust of other people. But if you choose that technique, then I would suggest that you lead by example and you share a failure story first. But even small things like having lunch together or coffee together can be great ways to connect with people, get to know people, and again, build a little bit of trust. Involve people in product decisions and encourage them to share their ideas and concerns. So I think I'm a big advocate of collaborative decision making, particularly when we deal with complex decisions or high impact decisions, in order to leverage the knowledge and creativity of the stakeholders and the development team, but also create a shared understanding and get buy-in from people, make it more likely that a decision then actually is executed and people actually go through with the decision. But it doesn't mean dictating the decision. It means really taking into account people's interests and needs and ensuring that everybody is heard and everybody feels heard and appreciated. But it also doesn't mean trying to please everybody and taking into account all the ideas. That's usually neither possible nor desirable. So a collaborative decision-making is not about agreeing on the smallest common denominator or pleasing people. It's about finding a decision that is sustainable and acceptable, but also moves your product forward in the right way. And what you do is, when you involve people in product decisions, is you show that you value and appreciate people's ideas, and that again builds trust. Then be supportive and offer help whenever possible and appropriate. So, care about people, but at the same time, don't neglect your core responsibilities as a product owner and don't sacrifice sustainable pace. So an area where I feel that product people often lend a helping hand is the lack of a qualified Scrum Master. So many product owners I meet don't have Scrum Masters at all, or don't have a Scrum Master who is qualified and sufficiently available. And then it's quite common for product owners to fill the gap, step in and take on some of the Scrum Master responsibilities, maybe look after the development process and help out the development team with the process and self-organization and so forth. And while I think it's great to care and it's good to wanting to help, if that becomes a permanent solution, I think it's not helpful. Being a product owner itself is a very challenging and demanding job. There's lots to it. By adding more responsibilities to the role, that makes it even harder and makes it even more challenging. And secondly, what we then do as product owners is that we try and put up with a system that's not designed, set up in the right way. So we essentially mask an organizational impediment. And I think it'd be better to really allow that impediment to surface and then find ways to address it and address the underlying causes. Why aren't there enough Scrum Masters? Why aren't there enough qualified Scrum Masters in the organization? And then finally, strengthen your product management expertise. It's hard for the stakeholders to follow your advice and trust you if there are gaps in your product management knowledge, be it around the market that your product addresses, be it around the product category that your product belongs to, be it more around general product management methods. I met a product owner a little while ago, and she was complaining to me that her management wouldn't trust her to take on strategic product owner responsibilities around the product roadmap and the product strategy. So we got talking, and I asked her after a little while, just for my purpose, help me understand, have you actually created a product roadmap in the past? And she looked at me slightly surprised and said, like, well, no. So I said to her, well, I can see why it might be then challenging for your boss to trust you to take on all the strategic decision-making authority for your product. And of course, it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. Like if my boss isn't supportive and doesn't encourage me to acquire new skills, it might be hard for me to do it. But at the same time, there's so many good books, blog posts, videos, templates on product roadmaps available these days. So sometimes then, acknowledging that there may be a knowledge gap and addressing it and showing people actually there's something useful I know about this topic, and being proactive can be more helpful than waiting for people to, ask us to do it. So again, maybe an opportunity for some of you to build trust here. I think as product people, again, we have such a demanding and such a multifaceted job. So it's quite common to have little gaps and it's quite common to have weaknesses in our product management knowledge. So to summarize, dealing with difficult people is part and parcel of being a product owner, no matter if we like it or not. I guess most of us probably don't enjoy dealing with difficult people that much, but I really do think, it is part of our job. And I think it's at least as important as other product management work, like attending to the product roadmap or prioritizing the product backlog. And I believe it would be a mistake to say, well, all these people issues and these relationship building issues, I'll deal with them when I have time. But first, I must do the important work. Let's attend to the product backlog and let's write a few more user stories. I don't think there's that much point writing user stories, if there are bigger conflicts that need to be addressed and that may hold you back. And then just to remind you, conflicts that aren't resolved don't go away. They tend to linger and they can affect relationships, impact our mental well-being, and reduce productivity. So, they tend to hold us back in one way or the other. So it's worthwhile unearthing them and addressing them in the right way. And then for me, learning to resolve conflict and building trust are key leadership skills that product owners should actively develop. I think we benefit from developing those skills and making an effort to do so. They allow us to strengthen the connections with the stakeholders and development team members. They help improve the work environments, and they help us grow as individuals and as leaders. So I hope that you found what I had to share a little bit helpful. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to find out more about my thoughts on product leadership, please take a look at my website. And as Tagi kindly mentioned, I recently published a new book called How to Lead in Product Management. It talks more about conflict resolution and dealing with stakeholders. And I'm very much looking forward to your questions right now. But if for whatever reason your question doesn't get answered, or there's a follow-up question that you'd like to ask me, then please reach out and drop me a line. So thank you. Stakeholders, generally speaking, in my mind, shouldn't prioritize, certainly not the product backlog. I think the product backlog should be prioritized by the product owner with the input from the development team. And then another area in which prioritization tends to be helpful is the product roadmap, where you say, okay, what outcomes or benefits or goals do we want to achieve with our product over, say, the next 6, 9, or 12 months? And what's the order in which those goals or outcomes or benefits should be achieved? And what kind of key deliverables or key results or key features, key capabilities should be provided? But again, I don't think it should be the stakeholders who tell the product owner what needs to be done. It should be the product owner who leads that conversation. And if no agreement can be reached, if no form of consensus can be reached, I personally think the product owner should be empowered then to make a decision. So in order to be able to progress the product, to move on the product. So stakeholders should be involved in product decisions, particularly important and complex product decisions. And I think you should always welcome their perspective and views and try and understand where they're coming from, what are their underlying interests and needs. But at the same time, as a product owner, our job is not, or as product owners, our job is not to please the stakeholders or wait for the stakeholders to tell us what to do. We're in charge of our product, or at least we're meant to be in charge of our product. We're meant to own our products, at least as a Scrum product owner. So when I talk about, I should have clarified that at the beginning, apologies. So when I talk about a product owner, I mean a Scrum product owner, not a safe product owner. I mean a Scrum product owner who really owns the entire product, the offering. And as such a product owner, you should be empowered to prioritize and make the product decisions with the input of the stakeholders and the development team.
Thanks, Roman. Peter, do you want to try the next one?
Yeah. So next question is, does it make sense to establish comprehensible transparency for all stakeholders in the PO prioritization? Your thoughts and best practices are much appreciated, Roman.
Yeah, another nice question. Thank you for asking it. So I think ultimately, so personally, I think being transparent and being honest with people is healthy and valuable. It builds trust, as I said earlier, and it shows people that you value them. So I you know, apart from, you know, if there's some confidentiality reasons that prevent you from sharing information, you know, apart from those issues, I don't see why you wouldn't want to be transparent and share information. And my preferred way of involving stakeholders in the product management work and in the innovation process is by inviting them to participate in, you know, what people like Teresa Torres and others refer to as product discovery. So, you know, having a kickoff workshop where you describe the product vision and the initial product strategy, and then validating assumptions and carrying out some market and user research. And then continuing to engage people when you build the product or when you start enhancing and updating the product, and making sure that the stakeholders regularly attend the sprint review meetings, you know, at least once a month as a rule of thumb. So they stay in the loop, they stay involved, and they can share their perspectives and their ideas and concerns. And, you know, they build a relationship with you, you build a connection with them, but they also have a relationship to the product, and they understand the context in which the decisions are being made. I mean, the alternative is that you kind of draw up the product roadmap and the product strategy, and then you go from stakeholder to stakeholder and try and, you know, get people's agreement and maybe try and convince people or persuade people. But I find that quite a laborious task. And the drawback is that then in some cases stakeholders aren't aware at all of their mutual ideas and needs, and that you as the product owner, you're left with trying to kind of broker some form of agreement and in some cases a compromise. So I'm personally more of a fan of, again, bringing people together and having collaborative sessions. But this does imply that people are willing to collaborate, that people are willing to open up, and people are willing to treat each other essentially as peers. So if you have stakeholders who want to dominate, who are very selfish, who want to win and maximize their personal gain in every single decision, or in every single meeting, then, you know, it'll be very difficult to truly collaborate with those individuals. I think that's another instance of a difficult stakeholder where you may have to practice some active listening and some empathy.
Cheers, Roman. So I'm gonna switch to a little bit of a different theme here that we got in questions. So Philip is saying, why do large organizations still hesitate to combine business product owner and IT product owner within one large Scrum team, which is the greatest advantage of Agile in my eyes?
Yeah, nice question. Thank you for asking it. So the idea certainly of the Scrum product owner is that the product owner connects business and development, or IT. So product owner is somebody who understands about the business, understands about the users and customers, the market, and somebody who can talk to the development team. And by bringing together kind of the business capabilities and the technological capabilities, the product owner fosters innovation. But yeah, it does mean that you find individuals who are capable of playing that role, and that you empower individuals, and you create the right organizational environment so that those individuals can actually play this product owner role. Now, why are companies hesitant to do it? I mean, there are a number of reasons. So, you know, some companies historically don't have any product management function. You know, it's true for many banks and insurance companies, for many retailers, for many companies within the tourist sector and media, publishing, where traditionally, you know, there are no product owners, there are no product managers. So, you know, for those companies, many of those companies have started to create, introduce product owners and, you know, product roles in recent years. But in some cases, you know, it's still pretty new. It's still a learning process. So, you know, no effective product management function has been established. Or maybe the company has started to establish a product management function and has a product management or product owner group, but people aren't adequately empowered yet. Maybe people lack skills. Maybe people aren't being trusted. So I think ultimately you'll have to do a little bit of inquiry and figure out what are the causes, and talk to the people in the organization, and maybe talk to the decision makers and find out what prevents product owners from really being that connector, being that glue between the users, the business, and the development teams. And what would you have to change? What would have to be put in place in order to enable people to play that role, to be a product owner in that sense?
Thank you, Roman.
Okay, then maybe also the next one, not so much on too much information and domination, but the other way around, how to deal with stakeholders with no own opinion, no clear vision, or vague ideas only.
Yeah, good question. So for me, the way innovation works in an Agile Scrum-based process is that product owner and development team are tasked with innovating the product. So either building a new product or progressing an existing one. And so in my mind, you shouldn't expect that stakeholders come to you and say, do this, do this, do that. I think in many cases, stakeholders really benefit from having some form of guidance, at least initially. It very much depends on the experience of the people that people have, how long people have been with the company, how much people have been exposed to the product or similar products in the past. But generally speaking, it's not the job, I think, of the stakeholders to say, do this or that, or we need this feature or that feature. It's the job of the product owner and development team to find it out. And when you look at a process like Scrum, what Scrum offers is an empirical process that allows you to inspect and adapt, to systematically experiment, to build a product increment, show it to users, show it to customers, show it to the stakeholders, and listen to their response and see how they react to it, and see what suggestions they have, and then inquire why they have certain suggestions or certain concerns or certain ideas, and then consider their feedback, and then learn from it and make the appropriate changes in the product backlog, adapt the product backlog, build the next product increment. So the product owner, for me that's really important to understand in a Scrum context, has really the leads the product, owns the product on behalf of the product, hence on behalf of the company, hence the name, person who owns the product on behalf of the company. And so, as the product owner, you have to make the tough decisions. You should listen to the stakeholders. That's at least my recommendation. You should involve them. But you have to make sure that the right decisions are being made, or decisions are being made that move your product forward in the right way. And if you're not sure, experiment. If you're not sure, then if you're not sure if you should go for A or B, choose one, run a sprint, see what happens, and then inspect and adapt.
And I think that's maybe also just another conflict or disalignment, whether are we trying to align to the spirit of Scrum or not? And some people might and others do not. So this might be also something that needs clarification.
Yes, that's right. Great. So I'm gonna pick the next one in sake of time. So I'm gonna pick the question from Bernd. He says, how can you deal with stakeholders whose opinions are automatically accepted by other stakeholders because it's difficult to discuss with them?
Yeah, great question. And I think it's a difficult one for me to answer. So what I find really helpful is to spend enough prep time for collaborative sessions, for workshops with stakeholders and development team members, so that you maximize the chances of success. And what I mean by this is to not only think about which meeting room to choose, and maybe about materials you need, do you need any post-it notes or paper cards, those kind of things, but also think about who's going to facilitate. And often I find a qualified Scrum Master makes a great facilitator, because the product owner is usually expected and required to actively contribute to a, say, product backlog, maybe not a good example, a product roadmap session, a product roadmap workshop, or a product strategy session. And so then making an active contribution and facilitating at the same time can be very challenging. And facilitating does involve suggesting ground rules or reminding people of ground rules. So for instance, a ground rule could be to to be aware of how much people contribute and allow others to speak up as well. And then facilitation would mean actively encouraging people to speak up and asking people who've already contributed a lot, have spoken a lot, to give others the room. And it would also involve thinking about suggesting the right decision rule. So, you know, a common decision rule that is used in product management would be, for instance, unanimous agreement. Another example would be consent. So unanimous agreement means everybody thinks the decision, the idea is really great, and that's absolutely the right decision. Great, because, you know, super strong support, but often difficult to achieve, or at least, you know, time consuming. Takes time to get to that level of agreement. Consent means nobody has any meaningful objections. It's often much easier to achieve, and it means people can say, yeah, everybody says, yeah, I can live with it. I'm okay with it. You know, so it's not the same level of agreement, obviously, but often good enough to progress it. But so, you know, again, that's something to think about in a collaborative workshop. And finally, the decision-making process you want to choose. You know, so a common way is to encourage diversive thinking and think about techniques, how you can actually tease out different ideas and, you know, sort of, you know, in some cases, even conflicting ideas before then people try and understand each other's perspective and underlying needs. And then you try and converge and reach a form of conclusion and come up with a decision that is sustainable, that people can actually and will implement, and that moves your product forward in the right direction. So for me, it's really down to facilitating and finding a skilled facilitator, but also then setting up the meeting, reflecting on who's going to be in that meeting. But I think you also want to establish the right behavior and clearly communicate expectations. And I know it's difficult when you have some very senior people in the room and they want to dominate. But at the same time, if you allow people to dominate, they'll just do it. And, you know, I don't think that's healthy. I mean, you know, allowing the hippo to win, the highest paid person's opinion, I don't think is necessarily in the best interest of everyone. And it's usually not in the best interest of the product and the users. So maybe go and talk to your Scrum Master, maybe think about what you can do in terms of preparing the meeting, setting up the meeting, and helping individuals who have unhealthy or difficult behaviors reflect on how they act and adjust their behavior. Again, final thing I'm going to say about this, the model I showed you, the behavioral change Stairway model, might help you with this. And again, what the model suggests is that you engage by listening and empathizing with people to build trust and then be able to influence them and help them change their behavior for the better.
Okay. The next one is about proxy PO. How often do you encounter a proxy PO, and how should the team deal with raising tensions between disagreements between the PO and the proxy PO?
Yeah, interesting question. Thank you for asking it. So proxy product owner is somebody who acts as a product owner, but is not empowered to take all the necessary decisions. So, you know, quite a common occurrence of proxy product owners, in my experience, is bespoke work. When you work in an agency environment and you develop a solution or an app for a specific client, and then often the client is the actual product owner, but may not have the time or the knowledge and skills or the interest to fully take on the role. And then you have on the agency side maybe a project manager who plays a proxy product owner and does the product backlog work and engages with the development team, but is not allowed to make any strategic product decisions. So essentially what happens is that the product owner role is split. Now, it's not uncommon, but I think generally speaking, it's not a desirable state to be in. It's not a healthy state to be in. And I think that's what the question suggests when there's conflict. Difficult for me to advise how to deal with it in general. I think the best suggestion I can make is to consider how can you avoid having product owners. So, you know, take the agency example. The way I do things in my business with the website that we offer, romanpichler.com, where I'm the product owner of that product. and then a development team based at the south coast of the UK designs and builds the product. And so, you know, I'm a member of the customer organization, the client organization, but I'm playing the product owner role. And my business is playing the product owner role. I'm the product owner. And that's worked out really nicely for us over the years. Alternatively, a customer may decide, no, that's too much involvement. We don't need this. We don't want this. But then I think the agency, the IT solution provider, should really have the ownership. But then the customer will really just offer advice and feedback and suggestions, and it'd be up to the agency to make the right product decisions, if that's what the customer prefers. So in that scenario, it's often then best really to discuss the different options with the customer and let the customer, the client, decide. If the setup is more about, say, an IT development piece where you have maybe the customer is HR and then you have an IT proxy product owner, it's a similar thing. I think it's then really going and inquiring what would it take for HR to play the product owner role, and what prevents the HR organization to fill that role. Because I think often it is, you know, particularly when you develop bespoke products, makes then sense for a member of the, you know, the client organization, the customer organization to play that role, rather than, you know, somebody from the solution part or the solution organization, the agency.
Thanks, Roman. I think we're kind of out of time. We've got just 2 minutes left. So I'm going to wrap this up. We've got quite a bunch of good questions. I'm going to chase up with Roman to see if these questions could be answered in a way or another after the meetup. But I would like to appreciate your questions and attendance. Thank you very much, Roman, for joining us today. We really appreciate that. We got very good feedback from your last talk that you did with us at Agile Munich, and I'm sure this feedback from today's meetup is going to be just as good. Do you have any final words, Roman, before we close the meeting today?
Well, thank you for having me. It was really nice to be with you again. I hope it was a little bit useful. And for those of you who work as product owners, you know, product management is a fairly young discipline. Product owners haven't been around for that long. And so, you know, often we find ourselves in challenging situations. And I think, you know, it's important to recognize that. And it's not always easy doing a good job, doing an effective job as a product owner. So don't be too hard on yourselves, and, you know, give yourselves a pat on the back. And at the same time, you know, see how you can hone your own skills and advance and develop your own skills, and maybe encourage the people around you and the organization around you to change for the better. But it often does take, you know, some time and patience and perseverance. So yes, thank you.